Hello, everyone, and welcome to Crimes of Our Times Live. I'm your host, filmmaker John Borowski. You may know me from films such as Serial Killer Culture and books such as the upcoming Panzram at Leavenworth. And today my co-host is Katherine Ramsland, author, professor, and just a great friend. We've been actually working together since I think we worked together first on my Albert Fish film, and then we worked together on Carl Panzram. And Katherine Ramsland is the author of many, many books. A few of them are Human Predator, which is, like a history of, serial killers, a phenomenal book. I mean, all of her books are phenomenal, but, these are really, and Confession of a Serial Killer, the untold story of Dennis Rader, the BTK. But we were just talking. Welcome, Katherine.
I'm glad to be here. It's fun always to be with you. My students sure know who you are.
Yeah, and I was just thinking, how many books have you written?
I've published 68. That's not the same as how many I've written.
Well,
most authors know.
That's true.
That.
Well, like a lot of these musicians, like, when Prince passed away, or a lot of these musicians, they have this, library or catalog that they haven't worked on. And during this pandemic, that's when I've been doing kind of reaching in and, finding out what I haven't released or releasing new projects. I mean, has much changed for you? I mean, because you're a writer and are you still talk about the, are you still a professor at DeSales?
I'm a professor of forensic psychology. I teach undergraduate and graduate courses on serial killers and death investigations. I'm also the assistant provost at the university. So we have meetings all the time with Zoom and, other kinds of platforms. So I'm still working pretty much full time, but the lack of a commute and really not being on campus and having to go to things there has given me free time. And I actually finished a novel this week. And I'm working on my MFA.
That's awesome. I mean, you're a workhorse. And that's the thing, because, when I talk to people, everyone I talk to, when your name comes up, we all say, well, does she never sleep? I mean, how does that? You're like a Pinkerton detective. You never sleep.
I do sleep, but because I think that's really important to keep your mental health and and physical health, in top form so that you can spend hours writing. So yeah, I sleep and I exercise and I do. It's just that I think by the time, I've been writing 35 years, maybe. There's a certain efficiency that comes with that. If you get into the habit of just sitting down at your computer in the morning with your coffee and you have stuff to do, you have deadlines, I think you can write much more efficiently than if you only dabbled in it. I think it's very different if you spend hours and hours a day.
It's true, because that's the same for me. If I'm editing a film or working on a book, for me, that's the hardest thing to actually get into that groove to, okay, say from this time to this time, it's going to happen. And you have to, because your mind will come up with every other excuse not to do it.
Yeah, I actually find if you develop a habit of it, and I've even written a book about this. It's called Snap, Seizing Your Aha Moments. If you develop a certain habit and stay with it every day, pretty soon your body gets used to it. You develop body memories for it. And you don't make excuses because it just feels so natural to sit down and do this work. And it isn't that writing isn't hard. It is hard, especially when you have to really create something and not just, like write assignments or something, but you have to really create, keep track of characters, for example, do research. It is hard work, but I guess I just have come to really love it so much that to not write is more difficult on any given day than to actually do it.
And, I do want to talk to you about your, nonfiction and fiction work. But I wanted to talk about your new show. Okay. Murder House Flip on QB. Tell people what that's about and how they could see it. It's a very interesting concept.
Okay. Murder House Flip actually came out of my course called Dangerous Minds, which is about mass murders and spree killers and serial killers. That's the whole show is that. I mean, the whole course is that. So in that course, I was talking about a local crime of 3 juveniles who had slaughtered their parents and brother. And one of my students said, you know, that house is for sale. And bang, bang, bang. The idea, at the same time, I had been working with a friend who works for Sony, Josh Berman, was a former executive producer of CSI. We met on a cruise, a writer's cruise, and had been friends for a while. And he said, you know, if you have any ideas, send them my way. And it just sort of all came together in exactly the right way, although it still took 3 years to actually make it into something. So it's a house, it's a design show. It's a different kind of design show. And the original idea was to do like a flip or flop kind of thing, but then we realized we didn't want to buy all these murder properties and then maybe not be able to get, you know, sell them. So it became more of a murder house makeover where we actually would go to the spot where something happened, where a crime was committed, and completely redo that spot for the homeowners. If they wanted to sell, that was up to them. But it gave them a sense of peace. It healed the house. It erased some of the sort of aura of the murder. I mean, in one house, there was a ghost. This little girl had grown up with this ghost, and it turned out it was the same name as the murderer who killed his wife and daughter in the room she was in. So that's one of the houses that we went into. It was pretty spooky. We did Dorothy Puente's house in Sacramento, where she had 7 bodies buried in the yard. That was very interesting. And at first, the homeowners said, well, we don't really want to change the house. We like the house the way it is. And I said, well, I bet you want a new yard. And they did. And boy, did we transform it. It was stunning. I'm jealous of all these homeowners getting these beautiful transformations of their properties. So we took four houses, and Quibi is a new streaming service where you get like bites, quick bites. Quibi is quick bites. So you get 5 minutes of the crime, 5 minutes of the redesign and what are we going to do and the renovation, and then the reveal is the end. So each house has 3 parts. And now if you went on Quibi, and you can get it for free for I think 3 months. If you went on Quibi, you could see all the houses at once because they sort of dropped, you know, in individual segments. But right now, you know, they're all available. And so we're now going into planning for our 2nd season.
Congrats.
I loved it. I was an executive producer and a co-creator. And so I was part of the whole team. I'd fly out to do the pitches and do the planning meetings. You know, the whole thing was a blast because I really didn't know anything would happen, but wow, to be in, you know, these rooms with HBO people and Netflix, and, you know, that was just so fun to me.
Yeah. And that's the thing, you know, it's usually the experience or the journey, you know, that makes these. Now, is that show just domestic or is it international?
Right now it's California based because we really didn't know it was, you know, it's pretty expensive. Each of these renovations was a lot of money. So they wanted to keep it local so that you'd cut down on the travel expenses for the crew and all that. Where it will go from here, we're not sure. I imagine it will be in other parts of the country, but we would like to take it international too.
Right, because, you know, 2 that come to my mind when you said backyard is, of course, Dennis Nilsen's first place. Or no, first place. He would burn the bar.
Yeah, but that was an apartment. It was a rental.
That's true. Know. Yeah.
See, that's the trick, is you have to get, you know, something that somebody owns.
Right.
That you can actually really do a spectacular makeover. So I don't think Dennis Nilsen's place, either one of them would be particularly.
Casey's house is for sale. I mean, the new house on his property.
That was all knocked down. Now
I know.
I'd like to get Dahmer's house, childhood house from the bath. That'd be neat.
You know, a lot of people, when that went up for sale, I don't know if it still is, but people were
It is,
all of
well,
us.
it is, and it isn't. It's not on the market, but he wishes, we did talk to him. He would like to sell it, I think.
Yeah. It's a fascinating concept, and I'm glad you have a second season. That's really awesome. And
Well, it's so different because it's not just a
right.
gloomy, here's what happened in this house. It's really making over the area, learning about the murders, making it over, and the homeowners are really pleased. I mean, the fun part is the reveal when you see these shows, they all have that, but these people are really just so taken aback by the change in the feel of it, because like they haven't even been using that room because it creeps them out that somebody was lying there dead, and so we changed the whole aura of their house, not just the look of it, and it's really interesting. It's fun.
And also the paranormal kind of comes into that too, like you were saying.
We had two houses where something happened, and one, the guy had murdered and dismembered his wife in the bathtub, and when we pulled up the floor, there was blood underneath still from the murder, and also construction guy. And unfortunately, they cut this out of the action show, but we might do some outtakes. A light was playing on him, and everybody was asking, whose cell phone is that? Who's got that light? They couldn't find the light source, but there are these odd pieces of light on him. And so that was weird. Just as he pulled the floor up and the blood was revealed, that happened.
Wow, that's creepy. But you get those kind of happy accidents, when you're filming these things, I'm sure, too, because nobody could have predicted that.
Right.
Wow, amazing. And if we backtrack a little, I always find it interesting that, and I don't know if you know if this is true. Are, females the main audience for true crime? And why do you think that is? Because usually when I do my conventions, and, people that are into this stuff, I see a huge percentage of females fascinated by true crime, serial killers. There's a Dahmer group, I think you know of it, that has all these females that adore Dahmer and pledge their love to him, and he was gay and he's dead, but they still do it. Talk about that little.
With Bundy.
Yeah, talk about that, from a female perspective.
Well, I think there's sort of two ways into, more than two, but just some basic stuff here. There's two ways into true crime. One is the feeling of, that danger that you could have been the victim, that you're the one who's vulnerable, and there's a sort of frisson that comes with that experience. And so some of the people who are, like, let's just say the Dahmer group, who are filming themselves, lying on the floor, being his victim, or one woman tattooed his bite mark onto her butt, which is so distasteful. But I think she just has this kind of sexual sense of him that she just wants to express it that way. And she's not alone. There are a lot of people like that. And so that's primarily female, certainly. But there's a whole segment of male audience as well, and gay male audience. I mean, it's even a different appeal for them than it is for heterosexual males. I think that there's a sense of these killers are the alpha males, like they've broken the rules, and forged ahead without remorse, and they have that kind of, we're the leaders, and that there's a certain appeal to that. But also, there's the interest in going into this as your life's work, as forensic work, or as law enforcement, or attorneys, or something like that. So you get a fair amount of males in that. I mean, when I was in graduate school for forensic psychology, it was pretty much half and half. And each of the, students, and it was very new for women to be in forensics at all.
Right.
So, we're seeing some differences today, but I'm talking 20 years ago, you really didn't see women doing that much. I mean, I bet you remember, I was talking about this the other day, when true crime was considered the ghetto of writing. Like, you wanted to be a successful writer, true crime was not what you did at all. and how things have changed.
Right. You look at like the original Panzram book, Killer Journal of Murder, that tanked in 1970. That didn't do good at all. But if that were released now, bestseller, right? I mean, you're right.
What was considered, schlocky stuff, distasteful. Why would you write about stuff like that? It's icky, and you really didn't find that much out there, especially not that was really good. So it evolved, and I would credit, sort of the O.J. Simpson trial into the CSI era, into now what we're experiencing with everything serial killer. I think it's a lot about that.
Well, Mindhunter.
It goes in waves. It goes in waves because this is going to go away too.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you think that, I mean, what do you think of the show Mindhunter? And I think that also because I mean, professionally, I want to hear what you think about it. But for the general public, that really, I think opened a lot of interest for them too, because when I was at conventions after that hit, people were all over it and didn't feel that embarrassment or that shame, and this is kind of in, or it's pop culture now,
Yeah, I think I'd like to pass on talking about that because I've worked with John Douglas and Robert Ressler, the two real people that these characters are based on, and I know their families. I know there's a lot of crap in Mindhunter that is, to my mind, horrifying, that they would make it look like this was Ressler's real family.
I know.
I was offended by some of it. And some of it's just inaccurate in terms of how things work. I mean, they weren't even the founders of the profiling unit at all. Douglas didn't come into it for 6 years. So and Ressler was in it first, and he thought of the prison program. So and but he's dead now. So who's out there to say what was real and what isn't? And it's kind of, I understand the appeal of the show if you only think of it as fiction, but that's not how people are thinking of it.
Right.
So I think the killers' portrayals, not all of them appealed to me. I thought Bruto's was way off, but Ed Kemper was a good one. Henley was great. I thought that was a really good portrayal of Henley. I didn't think Speck was very good. So, I think if you're immersed in this, it's harder to watch something like that because Hollywood did take liberties, and people who don't know the real people will get the wrong ideas.
Yeah.
Like that there's a boy out there who's a budding serial killer who is in Ressler's family. Oh my God. If I were his wife, I'd sue.
I know. Yeah, I know. And I don't want to go into that either. But when I saw that too, I was, I know.
But immediately everybody said, oh, is this a true case? Is this real?
Right.
And it's humiliating to actual people. And I've worked with several FBI profilers. I just finished a book with Mark Safaric on spree killers. A lot of the way the work is portrayed, especially on something like Criminal Minds, is inaccurate. And so when you're in it, I'm not a profiler, but when you're in it that much, it makes it difficult to watch the fictionalized versions.
And when you watch these, whether documentaries sometimes too, but these shows or films, talk about the sensationalism aspect that doesn't always match up with the truths of the case, because I'm doing the Gacy case now, and going back, of course, everyone I'm interviewing is male. And like you're saying, that was that time period, the 60s, 70s. But, beyond that, all the officers and the prosecutors, that's what they're getting across to me. There's like, well, what's reported and what was the truth are two different things, the sensationalism, and talk about that.
Yeah. I like Terry Sullivan's book.
Yeah. Terry Sullivan. And then the other one, Buried Dreams, is great.
Yeah. I experienced this because I have clearly done a lot of stuff on Dennis Rader, the BTK serial killer, since I spent 5 years working with him on his his guided autobiography, I call it. And a lot of documentary people have approached me to speak to that. And there was one in particular, I won't name the network, but there was a big deal about the fact that Rader had identified an 11th victim and had an elaborate plan. It's all in the book. He had an elaborate plan of what he's going to do with her. And then, she's not named, but, we know who she is. And they kept trying to pressure me to name her. I said, no. So they found a woman who had written a book thinking she was the 11th victim, and they put that in their documentary. And all of us who had been participants in the documentary said, why did you do that? That's not her. She's not the one. Oh, well, she had a book and we knew it would get us a bigger audience. So that's what you're referring to, is this, we need to make sure we do something that's going to grab attention and get us big numbers, regardless of whether it's true. And I've seen it over and over and over. Elizabeth Bathory is one that bugs me all the time because no one knows what's true about her. We have so many myths surrounding her, and those myths were generated after, the century after she was dead. We don't know that she bathed in the blood of virgins or anything like that. And yet they must put that as factual because that's going to grab their audience. And so, yeah, that bugs me, that the whole idea of sensation and audience numbers, and we got to sell, our advertisers and whatnot, means that truth doesn't matter. What matters is telling these stories. And if we have to add things to that, so that's all right, because then they move on to the next one. The rest of us are here. Like, I start my serial killers class with the top 20 myths about serial. These are the things you think you know about serial killers, thanks to the media. And you have to get these out of your minds right now if we're going to do any good work in this class. And it's unfortunate, but that it's out there.
It is. And, I interviewed author Kim Kraft. She did a great book on Bathory, but you're right, and she found some of the original documents, but over time it, changes. And that's what I've, right. Again, going back to the Gacy case, when I was interviewing, the one of the lieutenants involved in the case now, Jason Moran, who's searching for the final 6 victims, he said, people always ask me, John, are there more than 33? There's got to be more than 33. He's like, people want more. He's like, aren't 33 deaths enough? And there aren't more, I mean, there just aren't.
Well, don't you think there's the one?
I think there is that one. You're right. I think there is the one that he knew, with his OCD, he knew that there were 5 off the river. So I think there was the one, but not like
one hit the barge. Right. And he said one hit the barge, and that could have easily gone anywhere.
But that dozens,
So I think 34 is probably.
Yeah, that's what I think. But, then people say, well, he traveled a lot and he was here. And then what about his mother's place? And, and I talked to the detectives. They said, we've done the ground search. There's nothing there. But people say, oh, yeah, there has to be.
That's the same for BTK. There's no way he stopped, because serial killers can't stop. Like, that is one of those myths. That is not true. We have certainly not just can they stop, they can turn themselves in and have done so. So, these myths get in the way of us really trying to understand the realities. And I hear that about Dennis Rader all the time, that there's a lot more.
I don't know, is it easy for you to quickly go through that myth list? Because I'm interested in that. Or is that like a whole hour?
Well, I don't have it memorized. But,
or a couple of them, some of them.
Oh, that there's very few female serial killers. That's one that's not true at all. And Eileen Wuornos is certainly not the first by any means.
I mean, there are so many.
In fact, one of the very first documented serial killers from ancient Rome was a female. So that's one of them. That's in there, right? Yeah. That they can't stop. They never stop. And that's another one. They want to get caught. Oh, I hate that one so much. Because There's this stupid Freudian interpretation of, let's say Randy Kraft is riding around with that guy in his car, and well, he wanted to get caught because that was obviously a mistake. No, he didn't want to get caught. He wanted to keep doing what he liked doing. So there's very few. You have the lipstick killer, Catch Me Before I Kill Again. You have a few like that, and some of them have turned themselves in. But the percentage of serial killers out there do not want to get caught. If they do make mistakes, it's not because they want to get caught subconsciously.
I know that.
Because people have a hard time with the idea that they don't feel guilty, but they don't. So, that's just part of trying to understand who they are and accepting who they are rather than projecting what we think they must be from our own experience. I talk a lot about that in my death investigation class. It's called My Side Bias, where police officers come into a scene and they can't believe, somebody would have stabbed themselves 83 times, so it has to be a homicide. Sorry. Suicides are amazing. And they use chainsaws and circular saws and a chainsaw guillotine. I swear, a woman made that one. But my side bias is if it's not what I would do or think or feel, then nobody does. And that's an unfortunate part of being human. And if you're going to do good work in this field at all, you must get out of that mind frame in order to get into the mind frame of someone else. So working with Rader, for example, it had to be, I needed to be able, not think like him. That's another
right.
myth that the killers have to be so close to being a serial killer in order to catch them. That's another stupid thing that's out there. And I don't have to think like him, but I have to allow him his space and how he talks. I had one law enforcement officer in Wichita say to me after the book came out, well, you didn't make him tell you the truth. I said, well, that was your job. I'm in psychology. His lies are equally important as behavior to me as any truth he might say, because I'm trying to get his whole world. You're only trying to get his confession. That's a big difference.
Yeah. And I want you to talk a little bit more about your work with Rader and the book, it's always interesting. I interviewed, I think a couple weeks ago, Steve Gianangelo, author of Real Life Monsters. And, he had mentioned that, because I had talked to him, well, what about when some of these serial killers like Rader, when he put the pillow under the victim's head before he killed them, what's that about? I mean.
Well, he likes to say he's a good guy who did some bad things.
What was it like working with him over those years?
It was actually, I still talk to him. We've been corresponding for 10 years now. He had this brilliant concept. He thinks I made it up, but he made it up, called cubing. And the idea is that you're all sides of the cube and you can slide onto any side. So one side says family man, one side says churchgoer, one side is thief, one side is serial killer. So you get whatever context you need, because emotionally they're not grounded deeply in any given identity the way most of us are. Like if you do something uncharacteristic, you feel it like, ew, that's weird. That's not really me. They don't feel that at all, because all they care about is what will get them what they want. And if they need to act this way, so they're actors. If they need to act this way to get this, they will. And it doesn't matter to them. And they have no sense of who they might hurt in the process. So working with Rader, on any given day, he might start talking about religion or something. I mean, at first he tried to play that with me, because the first woman who started the book and never finished it was very religious. So he was doing Bible studies and all this stuff. And then he starts that with me. I said, drop that right now, because I'm not playing with that. Oh, okay. No big deal. But where he really showed himself, and I didn't even think about this being useful, but it became useful as we started watching certain TV shows. So he told me to watch Bates Motel, which is not one I would have watched because it sounded hokey, but I think it's brilliant. Now that I've seen it, I think it was very well written. So he would talk about that character. Within those discussions, a lot of who he was would come out. The Americans was another one. That was his favorite show. He loved the idea that he was a spy when he walked around, looking in people's windows, whatnot. So The Americans, which is about Soviet spies planted in our country during the Reagan years, was very much like how he thought of himself. But the interesting part of that was when his daughter finally, 10 years after he was caught, gave an interview to the press and said many of the same things that the daughter on The Americans said when she started realizing her parents weren't all she thought they were. So those two sentiments were very similar. And I mentioned it, and he's like, I don't know what you're talking about. I have no idea what you mean. He just said complete wall that he had actually heard his daughter in that way. He can watch a character say those things. You cannot hear his daughter say those things. And then he got really angry at me. And there were a few times like that he didn't like being called on what clearly was going on. And then he'd sit and write 3 or 4 pages to me, justifying it all, explaining it all, which for me was great because it was material. I mean, we played chess games. One chess game went like 3 years. I didn't care if I won. I cared what would he say about certain moves? How was he going to come back at me? What was going to happen? I mean, his first words to me were, now don't cheat. Like, okay, you're a serial killer. I'll cheat if I want to.
And, when you were, I heard that he like writes in certain codes or he has words, like he'll have names for people and.
Yes. Yeah, I think I got 2 names in the course of all this. He has names for people. Part of it is that he didn't want the guards to know what he's saying, because everything can be recorded. We were on the phone every week, so all of that is recorded and can be listened to easily. But part of it too was that whole idea of being a spy. He liked the code thing. But as we moved, like my first chapter is all about the codes he wanted me to go through to kind of prove I'll play the game. I was happy to do that, except he kept forgetting what some of it meant. So finally, I ended up writing the code that we used, which is kind of funny because one of his big issues is women having control over him. And there I was being writing.
You did it. That's awesome. I mean, I love that fact.
And the fact is, he thought of me as kind of his secretary writing down his life story, but he never gets to read it. He has no idea what I actually said.
So, but has he read the book?
He can't. It's contraband.
Wow, that's really interesting.
No, people will send him his many, many correspondence. They'll tell him, but the problem with if a guard reads a letter to him and it mentions anything about his murders or, anything like that. And I've had this happen to me. Immediately you get a nasty letter from the prison system. You do this again, you will be cut off for good. You get a nasty letter and then he gets told that this cannot go on. And so, it's very dicey to try to if somebody gets it to him. Now, somebody did send him the cover. How that got through, I don't know, but he liked it because he loves ropes and bondage and all that. So he loved.
Yeah, cover. You could see it in the background here, the ropes and the bondage. Yeah, it's a great book. I mean, really insight into his mind and his caves and his creatures and the H.H. Holmes connection. That H.H. Holmes connection. That was talk about his fascination with H.H. Holmes. He was like his hero. He wanted to be him.
Well, one thing that was different about Rader that here's a guy in the 50s, 60s, 70s already thinking about serial killers, even though nobody's even using that terminology. He's reading True Detective magazines. He sees the Harvey Glatman pictures of the women bound and, for the photographer. who know they're going to die. And I think he's about 14 when he saw that. So he's developing sexually, and that became the image seared into his brain for the most high erotic experience he could imagine. Around the same time, the in cold blood murders, the Clutter murders, happened in Kansas, about 200 miles to the west of him. He was in a car with a girl he had a crush on when that came over the radio. So that, feeds into it as well. And many of the things that happen at the Otero house, by the way, are very much a shadow of the Clutter family murders, including the pillow under the head, by the way. So then he also read another True Detective magazine about H.H. Holmes, but he'd already heard a little bit about that from some relatives who had been in Chicago, so he already knew a little bit about that. In his mind, he took that murder castle, that 3-story hotel, and projected it into a barn because he's in Kansas. And so in his mind, he could see all the layers of torture things in barns and silos and whatnot. So his fantasy life surrounded the idea of, he always wanted to do these girl traps. As an adolescent, he wanted to build girl traps because girls threw him off. He always felt, like not in control when girls are around. So trapping them would make him in control. And so he put these traps in his mind into the barns, including a railroad track. So that's a trick because he wanted to tie them like Nell on the Dudley Do-Right cartoons. He wanted to tie them to the railroad tracks, but have the train run them over. Nobody gets to rescue them. So the train tracks were in the barn too.
Yeah, I thought that was I thought it was interesting, but it does, with a lot of these serial killers, do you believe that fantasy and, the fantasy and then the manipulation, do a lot of them have those kind of characteristics? Because, we've been talking about that a lot in these series.
Well, I mean, most of the fascination is on sexually compelled serial killers. And obviously not all serial killers are sexually compelled. We don't hear a lot about the other ones because they're just not that interesting, right? That's why we don't hear a lot about females. They're not as interesting as the males because they, although they can and have done some pretty nasty things, they don't tend to engage us quite the way these sexually compelled and especially sadistic, organized, predatory offenders do. So, we don't really care that much about the vampire of Sacramento because he's kind of delusional. Okay, he's interesting, but nobody's going to get all Bundy-esque about him, right? Nobody's putting his bite marks on their body or eating the brains of kids just to be like him. So we just aren't that engaged by something like that, but we are engaged by people who planfully craft what they're going to do to somebody, stalk them, keep their focus on them, because that's part of it. It's also the vampire myth, that total focus on the person he's going after. I think there's a real erotic attraction in that. So of that subset of serial killers, we then look at how they developed, and many of them did develop a fantasy life that became rehearsal fantasies for what they expected to do or wanted to do. Certainly, Bundy described it. I don't know about Gacy. I don't know if Gacy had much of a fantasy life, at least not that he said so much about.
He never really mentioned that kind of stuff. I mean, to him, and again, I think, obviously, he was repressing, his homosexuality. So, that wasn't talked about, and then his somewhat confession later. But, I think he just, when he reached that age and the ability to do it, he just started doing it, and.
Well, and the thing is, I think his confession is quite different from the way Kemper and Dahmer and Bundy confessed, and Rader, because his confession was utilitarian. It was going to serve his purpose in a way, whereas with the others I just named, it was more, oh, now you got me, I'm going to tell you. And so I think Gacy probably had those fantasies, but they didn't serve a purpose the way it did for the other ones who were saying it. Because I think he, given, his start with molesting boys in Iowa and whatnot, I think he definitely had a fantasy life. He just,
I think you're right, because obviously he knew what he wanted, and so he must have fantasized about that, and just the opportunity presented himself. I think with that first victim, picked him up, and it was like, okay, now I'm just gonna kill him and bury him and hide it, and well, guess what? Nobody comes looking for him.
Right. And I think the ones who are stalking, because not even all sexually compelled serial killers are stalkers. The ones who are stalking are really planning. I mean, they're living what they're going to do 24/7. This is exciting to them. This is where they feel alive, no matter what they're doing, whether you're president of your church congregation and a family man. If you feel most alive when you are looking for a victim and planning your murders, that's your fantasy life. And I think that is a rehearsal fantasy, because much of what we see in what they did actually do is matched by what they talk about with their fantasy lives.
And it's that preparation for becoming the predator, and learning and taking those stages. Yes. But especially now that I've got Gacy under a microscope, I'm like, man, he really, each thing he learned, okay, the one victim bled on the carpet, so I'm going to stick underwear down their throat, or I'm going to do this, and I'm going to strangle them. I'm not going to stab them. So with each...
And that's the way Rader was too, exactly.
Yeah, it was very interesting, and so we have some questions, and I was interested in that too. Do you think technology plays a role, in because people ask me this at conventions too. They say, well, do we just not hear much about serial killers anymore? Or obviously we had the golden age, with the Gacy and the Ramirez and, what some of us refer to as the golden age. But, are we just not hearing much? Is technology playing a bigger part? Because prosecutor, William Kunkel from the Gacy case said, oh, no one now could ever get away with 33 murders.
Yeah, he's wrong about that. How about Sam Little? He's wrong about that. First of all, our knowledge of serial killers around the world has expanded exponentially. Secondly, serial killer definitions went from 3 to 2. Did that ever open things up? Thirdly, when the 70s, 80s is like the big golden age into the early 90s, that was all new. It's like when CSI came, everyone was obsessed with it. Now everybody's like, oh, I already know all that stuff. That's the same thing that happens with serial killers, because they're just repeating now what all those people did before. So they're not as interesting. And many of them, frankly, they're not white guys. We have a lot of Black serial killers now, Hispanic serial killers, and the media just doesn't go after that. But they're there. They're out there. It's not that hard to find them. And a lot of other countries are now reporting them. I've seen a number in South Korea had some. Japan has had a few recently. They're certainly out there. So are there less? I don't think so. I know people have made that claim, but I don't see the evidence of it. When I did my book, I did it by decade, and certainly we still see a lot of them. They're just not in the media because they're not doing something spectacular. Like Dahmer ate people, even though he didn't really. That's what people think of him. He didn't even like the taste of flesh. He tried it and didn't like it. So he's not really a cannibal, but that's what they
total distaste. But and that's what we find. But do you feel that because of video cameras, cell phones, tracking technology, or do you feel like me? I think it still comes down to tried and true detective work. Like when we look at,
I think it comes down to, the book that's coming out in July is How to Catch a Killer. And it's 30 serial killer cases. A number of them are about really solid detective work. A number of them about the killers making mistakes or turning themselves in, but quite a few are really outstanding police work. And that's really what happens. We've had serial killers like, let's say, Stephen Griffin in England, where he was for his, I guess it was master's thesis, he was studying where all the cameras were so he could figure out where he could go grab some women and take them back and kill them. Now he stupidly made a mistake, but that was pretty clever, and maybe that's what Jack the Ripper did, for all we know, because he might have studied the police beats at that time. They were very uniform. You could have studied them and figured out when was an opportune moment. So I think we're still seeing people clever like that, but among those who are careless or delusional or impulsive, they're going to get caught.
Yeah, I always thought it was interesting. I don't remember his name now, but the guy that I think he lived in Alaska, and he would travel and bury. Yeah, and he was like that, thinking, well.
Well, listen, if he hadn't let the one, made the one mistake, he took women into wilderness areas where nobody went. And he could have gotten away with that.
There's always that one mistake, right? And then, I wrote a script a long time ago, and I'd love to do it in the future, but it's like, when somebody tries to, commit or think of that perfect murder, there's always something that, they can't predict, a neighbor coming or, something happening that.
Well, that's what happened to Rader. I mean, he was lucky most of the time. He didn't get caught, not skillful. They just lucky because
but I mean, he wasn't a dumb guy, but then people would say, well, maybe he did want to get caught, because why the heck would he ask them that question? It's like, that was what was that? Was that a slip up, or do you think he just was that? Do they get to that point where they're above it?
No. I mean, are you talking about the computer thing? No, he knew how to use computers. He asked a cyber cop, and in those days, cyber cops weren't, they were just playing catch up for the most part. They're not sophisticated like they were now. And that cop has actually even written an article about how he gave him the wrong information inadvertently. And because he did, Rader thought he was home free. And I'll tell you this, though, if he had used a disk that had not been used before, he was using a disk that he had put notes on for his church work. If he had used a brand new one, fresh out of the package,
trace it. Yeah,
I don't think so. Yeah. So it isn't that he used a computer disk; it's that he believed the error that the cop said to him, and then did the stupid thing. And he kicks himself to this day over that. And it isn't. A lot of people say it's because he didn't know what he was doing with technology. He did. Because he had a computer, but I think his printer at home wasn't working or something, so he had been using the church computer. And he thought the guy was telling him the right stuff, and then I think he actually asked him, "Can you trace an email address or I don't know, whatever it was?" And the guy said, "No."
I know. And that's the thing about Gacy too. When towards the end there, they said, well, obviously he picked that last victim up. He wanted to get caught, but it wasn't. I think it was that arrogance that I could do it in front of all these people. I just did 32 or 33. Yeah. Who cares? Nobody's gonna care.
Well, exactly. There's a thing called narcissistic immunity that develops in these guys when they don't get caught. They're already narcissists. It's a short step to thinking, I'm untouchable, I'm special, I'm destined. And even if they arrest me, they can't keep me. He displays that attitude as much as Bundy does. He definitely had that. And so there is that sense because he's gotten away with it for a long time. And and even when he molested the boys over in Iowa, he still got out early. He didn't even serve his whole sentence. So I can see why he'd think he's special. I just want to ask, should we be paying attention to questions on the side here?
Usually I get it. When we talked about the technology, they were talking about, Eric is asking, how do guys like Rader and Gacy reconcile their crimes with their so-called belief in Catholicism or Lutheranism? So, and that's the thing too, because There you
Cubing.
go. That's the answer. Cubing. One day I'm
That's
like
it.
this,
That's
one day I'm
exactly
like
it.
that, and that's how it is.
And also, God
Yes,
forgives
and
me.
right, and you could
That's an
confess your
easy one.
sins, right? And it goes away. Right?
Which is what I think he sees, because he's like 75 now, and he's thinking, okay, the gig's up, and I got to start thinking about my potential death. And he does say, I'm a good person who did some bad things, and those bad things are forgivable.
Interesting.
He's not wrong.
Let's see. We got a couple more here. Yeah, technology. We were talking about that. The new Dahmers, but yeah, I mean, we covered some of those. But yeah,
Okay.
but talk about your latest book,
Okay.
How to Catch a Killer. That's your latest, right? And then your new one. Oh, that's the one.
That's the
Talk
one
about
that's
that.
coming in July. Yeah. Yeah, it was supposed to come out in April, but it's the publisher is Sterling, and they're a Barnes and Noble affiliate, so all the stores closed. They're not going to, take that. And it's they wanted me to write about cases. At first, they came and said, "Why don't you write about, maybe 10 cases?" And so I gave them a list of 80. That I like, here's all the people I could talk about. So then we narrowed it down to 30, and I have them in categories. And they wanted some females, they wanted some from other countries. So it's the ones you would expect, Bundy and Gacy and Dahmer in there. But you also will get the female wrestler in Mexico that most people haven't ever heard of. But all the cops thought she was a man, and they kept completely missing.
Yeah, I think I
when
heard
she
of
was
that
killing people. So yeah, that's a really interesting one. So I tried to find some that are very unique, but with the idea of, what lessons do we learn? Because there's always a takeaway. The structure of the book is for each case, you get what happened, but then you get the takeaways. What do we understand about this person? What do we understand about the way he or she was caught? There's some profiling in there, because in some cases, profilers were part of it. For example, the Meyerhofer case in Montana was the first one the FBI profilers did. Again, you didn't get that in the Mindhunter series, but it's a great case. And they were right on about who the chief suspect was, and the cops were like, "There's no way this is our guy." And it was 1974, 3 or 4. So there wasn't any database. There were no myths about serial killers at that point. But they were going on what they did know from crime books, from textbooks and things. There weren't very many of those either, but they were right, and they made some really interesting predictions. So that's how the guy got caught, is that they just kept on it, and finally the law enforcement fell into line and said, "Oh, this is the guy." Turns out. And then they set up a sting operation and got him. But so I tried to pick cases that certainly you would have heard of. So people love the familiar, so they're going to get that. But there are also some very unique and unusual cases.
I'm excited about that. I mean, all of your books are just, amazing. I mean, check out Katherine Ramsland's books. Where's the best place for them to find to find your work? Is it Amazon? Is it your site, publisher? I know.
I don't have
I saw
a
that today. I was like,
Stalking.
wait, what? Why?
Well, I don't want to spend my time building websites. I write. So I do a lot on Facebook, and and that goes off into Twitter realms, and who knows what's going to happen after the decisions today on social media. But I just, it was so hard to keep putting books into this thing, and it's too time consuming. And I just didn't think it was really working for me. So I stopped doing it. So yeah, if you want a book, they're on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, other sites, not a lot in bookstores anymore, because bookstores are not, carrying this stuff as much as they used to. Still, they're available, and I just write.
Do you find that you're selling more on electronic or physical?
There is a lot more of the ebooks than there used to be, definitely. And for example, the Rader book, I mean, we couldn't find a publisher for that except for an academic publisher, because a lot of the editors I had worked with thought it was just too dark. Also, the victims' families get the proceeds, and they didn't want to enter into that kind of agreement. I don't know why, but they didn't. So we finally found a publisher, but academic publishers are usually more expensive. However, the ebook is $9.99 versus $29. So ebook is, the way to go.
Yeah, and I think, some people seem to like both. Some people like the convenience of an ebook, but then some others like me, I'm old school. I like holding it and reading it and maybe mark. I haven't marked yours. Well, I probably have. Yeah, I've marked it up a little bit. We make our little notes and stuff. And, I mean.
Yeah, that's fine. And I use them in my classes. I use The Mind of a Murderer, which interestingly, I wrote before I got the Rader project. And I decided to look back 100 years to mental health experts who had spent time with an extreme offender, a mass murderer, serial killer, much more time than the ordinary assessment period. Like Zipperin went in to see Speck every single week until he wrote his book. So I wrote this book of a dozen cases from the past century where somebody really decided I'm getting the raw material of somebody's life story to try to understand these people. And right after I published that, the Rader book came along. So I was primed for, wow, I have all these great role models.
Yeah, that was perfect.
For how to do this.
And we've got about, 3 more minutes. If you could sum it up, we still don't really, there's still a lot of, theories about why serial killers do what they do, but we still don't know, right? I mean, there's no definitive answers, correct?
Well, serial killer isn't a criminal type. It's a description of behavior. So there's thousands of them. There isn't a way to sum them up. And there's nothing that sets them apart except that they killed at least 2 people on at least two different occasions. That's what sets them apart as serial killers. There's so much diversity in their psychology. I wrote a blog. The number one question people ask me about serial killers, which is it nature or nurture? It's not. I can't answer that. But I do talk about how you could take any given case and understand its influences such that a person went from being this child to being this serial killer. And Rader actually did that with me. He challenged me to find his factor X. And I did. And I think you can do it with any of these guys or women if they've given you enough information, as well as you have records that you can get enough information. It's always easy to think you have it all and now you know the whole story. But John, I think you're probably the most industrious researcher on these people that I know. And you still have that feeling there's still stuff you don't know that's out there, right? So it's hard to put it in any kind of formula to say we know what makes him tick. I know what makes Rader tick. I can't.
And I agree. I think there was that time period when profiling first began that they thought, okay, fire starting, bedwetting, cruelty to animals. This is what, but.
But there's not even any evidence of the triad, which is, and I did say that to them too. Like, you got to stop doing that because there's no evidence of it. Even their own research didn't support that. And yet
you're right.
It was such a nice, neat formula.
That's what people want. They want it, okay, one word, one description, here's why they do it, but you can't, and that's why, I agree you have to take these cases on an individual basis, and we are learning that, and that's why, when I do, meet people or when I'm at these conventions, sometimes I tell them, well, do you have 24 to 48 hours so you can talk about this? Because you're right. Yeah. Take Katherine Ramsland's class. Just go to Pennsylvania, take her class, but this has been great. We're going to wrap it up. Check out Katherine Ramsland's books, Amazon, all her works are on Amazon, and you'll see her on almost every show that's out there. Every time I turn on a true crime show, and you're great. And I hope we work together maybe on the Gacy thing with the, you know, the defense, not the, I'll leave you out of the clouds, but we can talk about his insanity defense, you know. But it's been great, Katherine. Thank you so much for being on. I really appreciate it. Thank you. We'll see you soon.
Thanks for having me. I've enjoyed it. Yeah. All right.